It began with a single step, not a dance of joy, not a celebration, but a step into a waking nightmare, a step that would echo through the streets of a terrified city, a step that would become a contagion, a mystery that has baffled historians and scientists for over 500 years. This is a story not of kings and queens, but of ordinary people, of a summer so strange, so terrifyingly bizarre, that if it weren't documented in countless town records, council minutes, and physician notes, we would dismiss it as pure folklore. Welcome to the Past Unfolded. Today we are traveling back to July of 1518 to the city of Strasbourg, a prosperous free city in the Holy Roman Empire, a place that is about to become the stage for one of history's most inexplicable events. This is part 1, the first step. To understand what happened, you have to feel the world these people lived in. The year 1518 was not a kind one. Strasbourg and much of Europe was reeling. Recent years had brought devastating famines. The harvests had failed. Bread was scarce, and what little there was often made from rotten, moldy grain. Disease was rampant. The French pox, what we'd call syphilis, was a terrifying new scourge. And perhaps most crushing of all was a pervasive existential fear. Superstition was not a pastime. It was a framework for understanding a cruel and unpredictable world. People lived under the constant shadow of divine wrath. They believed God, or a saint, or a demon, could punish an entire community for its sins. The atmosphere was a tinderbox of anxiety, dread, and mass psychosis. All it needed was a spark, and that spark had a name, Frau Troffea. We don't know much about her. She wasn't a noblewoman. She was, in all likelihood, a commoner, a wife, perhaps a mother. She was just one woman, trying to survive in a city on the brink. And then, one day in mid-July, she stepped out of her small house on the narrow, cramped Kepler Street, and she began to dance. It wasn't a dance for a festival. There was no music. Witnesses described it as jerky, compulsive, and agonizing. Her face was a mask of confusion and terror. She just couldn't stop. Her feet pounded the dusty street. Onlookers would have been confused at first, maybe even amused. But as the hours wore on, the amusement would have turned to concern. As the sun beat down, her feet began to bleed. Her slippers tore apart. She danced through blisters, through torn muscles, through sheer, utter exhaustion. Her husband pleaded with her. Neighbors tried to hold her down, to shake her out of it. But the moment they let go, the dance resumed. It was as if some unseen force, some invisible puppeteer, was pulling her strings. She danced for 6 days. Let that sink in. 6 days. Without rest, without food, without any conscious control. It's a physical impossibility, a one-way ticket to complete bodily collapse. By the end of the week, she was barely human, a broken, delirious shell, driven by a rhythm only she could hear. The city council was called, the priests were called, the physicians were called. What was this? Hysteria? A nervous fever? Demonic possession? Divine punishment? They had no answer. They decided the best course of action was to take her away, to lock her in a cart and transport her to a mountaintop shrine nearly 50 kilometers away. The shrine of St. Vitus Street Vitus was the saint you prayed to for help with dancing maladies. They hoped the sacred space would break the curse. And for a brief moment, as the cart rattled away from Strasbourg, the city must have breathed a sigh of relief. The strange spark had been extinguished. The nightmare was over. But it wasn't. It had only just begun. Because while Frau Troffea was being taken to the shrine, something new was happening back in Strasbourg. Another person started dancing, then another, and then another. Within a week, there were over 30 people in the town square, all caught in the same uncontrollable, torturous jig. The authorities were now in a state of full-blown panic. Their initial theory, that this was an isolated case of madness or possession, had just been completely demolished. This was something else. This was spreading. And here's where they made a catastrophic misdiagnosis. The city physicians, looking at the sweating, convulsing bodies, declared the cause was not supernatural, but natural. They called it a hot blood disease, an overheating of the blood in the brain, and they prescribed a truly shocking cure. They believed the only way to cure the dancers was to dance the fever out of them. Yes, you heard that correctly. The council, in its infinite wisdom, decided the solution to a mysterious compulsive dancing plague was to encourage more dancing. They cleared the main guild halls and the grain market. They built a massive wooden stage. And then, in a move that seems ripped from the darkest of comedies, they hired professional musicians to play lively, upbeat tunes, and they paid strong men to hold the dancers up and keep them moving. Think about the scene: the sweltering summer heat, the smell of sweat and fear and blood, the desperate, manic music, dozens of people jerking and flailing in agony, held upright by hired muscle, while the entire town looked on in horror. This wasn't a party, it was a public exorcism masquerading as a municipal policy. They were literally trying to dance the devil out of their city. But the plague didn't slow down, it accelerated. The stage became a vortex, sucking more and more people in. From 30, the number grew to 50, then to over 100. At its peak, chronicles suggest as many as 400 people were caught in the frenzy. The death toll began to rise. People were dying of heart attacks, of strokes, of sheer exhaustion. They were dancing themselves to death. Literally, the music and the stage had failed. The physicians were out of ideas. The priest's prayers seemed to go unanswered. The city was trapped in a nightmare of its own making, and there was no way out. The very air seemed infected with madness. Who would be next? Your neighbor? Your child? Your wife? You? So what was really happening in Strasbourg? Was it a poison? A mass hallucination? A curse? The people of 1518 had no way of knowing. They were living inside the mystery, terrified and desperate for any answer. But we, from our vantage point centuries later, can ask better questions. And in part 2, we will sift through the evidence, the town records, and the modern science to uncover the shocking truth behind the dancing plague. Because the real story isn't just about the dancing, it's about what happens when human fear meets a forgotten biological weapon, a secret hiding in plain sight in the very bread they ate. The stage was built. The musicians played. The city of Strasbourg had bet everything on a desperate, cruel cure: dance the devil out. But instead of salvation, they found only more horror. The plague was spreading, a fever dream made flesh. The question was no longer what was happening, but why? And how do you stop a sickness that moves to its own terrible rhythm? Welcome back to The Past Unfolded. This is part 2 of our investigation into the dancing plague of 1518. When we left off, the city was in chaos. Hundreds were dancing in a state of pure agony, and people were beginning to die. The authorities were out of ideas. They had tried science, they had tried spectacle, and they had failed. Today, we ask the question that has haunted historians for centuries. What was the true cause? To the people of the 16th century, the answer was obvious. It was a punishment. Specifically, the wrath of Saint Vitus. The legend went that if you angered the saint, he would curse you with a dancing mania. This is why they took Frau Troffea to his shrine. But this explanation raises more questions than it answers. Why would a saint, a figure of divine goodness, inflict such a brutal mass punishment? And why Strasbourg? Why then? The city's religious leaders pointed to a more general sin: moral failure. They preached that the dancers were possessed by demons, a physical manifestation of the community's spiritual corruption. This belief, this deep-seated fear of divine retribution, is not the cause, but it is the kindling. It's the reason the outbreak found such fertile ground. A terrified population is a suggestible one, but we have to look deeper. We have to look for a trigger in the physical world, and that leads us to the most famous and compelling theory, one that lies not in the heavens, but in the very earth beneath their feet. Meet Claviceps purpurea, ergot, a fungus that infects rye and other cereal grains. In a time of famine, like the one Strasbourg had just endured, people would have eaten whatever they could find, including moldy, low-quality grain. And ergot-infected grain is incredibly dangerous. It contains a cocktail of toxic compounds, including lysergic acid amide, a chemical cousin of LSD, and ergotamine, which constricts blood vessels. The symptoms of ergot poisoning, known as St. Anthony's fire. Anthony's fire are a horrifying match for the dancing plague. The vasoconstriction can cut off blood flow, leading to gangrene, the sensation of limbs burning, which might cause a victim to jerk and writhe in pain. But more importantly, the psychoactive compounds can cause severe hallucinations, convulsions, muscle spasms, and psychotic episodes. Imagine the horror. You eat a piece of bread, a simple act of survival, and then the world begins to melt. You hear music that isn't there. You feel an uncontrollable urge to move, your muscles twitching independently of your will. You are trapped inside a waking nightmare, your body rebelling against you. This theory seems almost perfect. It provides a tangible biological cause for the mass hysteria, but a good historian must also play devil's advocate. And the ergot theory, while elegant, has its problems. Firstly, ergot poisoning is notoriously debilitating. It causes such intense pain and gangrene that victims are often bedridden, not capable of dancing for days on end. Secondly, the outbreak was almost entirely confined to the city. If it was bad bread, why weren't the surrounding villages, eating from the same harvest, also affected? This forces us to consider another, even more human explanation, one that lives not in the grain, but in the mind. What if the trigger was psychological? What if the initial case, poor desperate Frau Troffea, was suffering from an extreme stress-induced psychosis? Remember the world she lived in: famine, disease, unimaginable poverty, and fear. The human mind can only take so much. Her bizarre, compulsive dance became a focal point for the city's collective anxiety. In a phenomenon known as mass psychogenic illness, or mass hysteria, the symptoms of one person can spread through a susceptible population, not through a virus, but through sight and sound and sheer, overwhelming fear. Think of it as a psychic contagion. You see your neighbor dancing, you feel the panic of the crowd, your own stress levels skyrocket, and your brain, seeking a release for this unbearable pressure, simply short circuits. It mimics the only outlet it sees. You start to dance because your mind has broken under the weight of a broken world. This theory explains why it spread so quickly and why it was concentrated in the city, the epicenter of the social stress. So, we have two powerful suspects, a biological poison and a psychological one. But what if we don't have to choose? What if the truth is a terrifying combination of both? Consider this. A community is weakened by years of famine. Their diet consists of low-quality, potentially fungus-tainted grain. This gives a segment of the population low-level poisoning, headaches, nausea, dizziness, a heightened state of suggestibility. They are physically and mentally vulnerable. Then, the spark. Frau Troffea, perhaps suffering from a more severe case or a unique psychological break, begins her dance. The community, already primed by superstition and fear, witnesses this. Their weakened physical and mental state makes them hyper-susceptible to the psychological contagion. The ergot didn't cause the dancing. It created the perfect conditions for the madness to take root and spread like wildfire. The bread didn't make them dance, but it might have made it impossible for them to stop. This synthesis feels deeply, tragically human. It wasn't just one thing. It was a perfect storm of bad luck, environmental disaster, and human psychology. A catastrophe born from the intersection of a toxic harvest and a toxic atmosphere of fear. But our story isn't over, because the people of Strasbourg didn't have the luxury of our theories. They were living it, and they needed it to end. So, what did they do? How did the dancing finally stop? In our final chapter, we will follow the desperate, last-ditch efforts of a city on the brink of collapse. We will witness the final act of this tragedy, and we will be left with a haunting question that echoes down to our own time. What does it take to break a spell? The answer is both surprising and profoundly revealing of the human spirit. Join me for the conclusion in part 3. The music had stopped. The musicians, themselves fearing the contagion, had likely fled or refused to play. The great stage in the Kornmarkt stood not as a place of cure, but as a gallows, a stage for a slow, public death. The dancers, now numbering in the hundreds, were mere specters of themselves, hollow-eyed, bleeding, dying from heart attacks, strokes, and pure exhaustion. The city of Strasbourg was drowning in a sea of its own terror. They had tried reason, and they had failed. They had tried force, and they had failed. There was only one option left. They would try faith one last time, but this time, not as a punishment, as a plea. Welcome to the final chapter of our story. This is part 3 of the Dancing Plague of 1518. The city had reached its breaking point. With all earthly solutions exhausted, the authorities made a fateful and desperate decision. They reversed their entire diagnosis. They declared that the plague was not a hot blood disease after all. It was not a physical illness that could be danced out. It was, they now concluded, a divine punishment, a curse placed upon the city by a wrathful God. And if it was a curse, then the only way to lift it was through divine intervention, through atonement. And so, they embarked on a campaign of radical penance. First, they banned all gambling and prostitution, the sins of the flesh, in the attempt to purify the city's morality. Then, they outlawed dancing, a seemingly absurd law given the circumstances, but a powerful symbolic gesture to show they were serious about repentance. But the most dramatic step was yet to come. The city council organized a massive, solemn religious procession. They gathered the most revered religious icons and relics. They summoned the city's most important priests and dignitaries, and they walked. Imagine the scene, a silent, grim-faced procession moving through streets usually filled with the sounds of commerce and life, now haunted by the ghostly, scraping dance of the afflicted. They walked past the Kornmarkt stage, a sight of utter horror. They prayed, they begged for forgiveness, and then they took the dancers themselves, those who could still be moved, on a pilgrimage. Not to a local shrine, but to the distant town of Saverne, to the grave of St. Vitus himself. This was no simple cart ride. This was an act of ultimate desperation. The chronicles are sparse here, as they often are at the most critical moments. They don't give us a day-by-day account, but the record shows that after the processions, after the prayers, after the pilgrimages, the dancing began to subside. By late September, it was over. Just as it had begun with a single, inexplicable step, it ended with a final, collapsing one. The survivors were left with broken bodies and traumatized minds. The city was left with a memory so bizarre, so painful, that it would spend centuries trying to explain it away as legend. But it happened. So, what are we to make of this? Did the prayers actually work? Did St. Vitus finally relent? The answer is likely far more human. The processions and pilgrimages did something crucial. They broke the cycle. They removed the dancers from the stressful environment, the epicenter of the panic. They replaced the frantic, terrifying music with solemn chants. They replaced the spectacle of the stage with the ritual of prayer. They gave the community a shared, positive action to focus on, instead of a shared fear. In essence, they treated the psychological contagion with a psychological cure. They offered a narrative of hope to replace the narrative of dread. For a population primed by faith, this was the most powerful medicine imaginable. It allowed the spell to be broken. The dancing plague of 1518 was not caused by one thing. It was a perfect storm. It was the toxic combination of primus, environmental stress, famine, disease, biological factors, the potential ergot poisoning weakening minds and bodies, and psychological pressure, a culture saturated in superstition and fear. It's a story that holds a dark mirror up to us today. We may not fear the curse of St. Vitus, but are we immune to mass hysteria? To the contagious nature of fear? We see it spread through our news feeds, amplified by algorithms instead of lute strings. We see communities gripped by panic, sometimes for very real threats, sometimes for misunderstood ones. The people of Strasbourg weren't foolish or primitive. They were human. They were trying to make sense of a suffering they could not understand with the tools they had available. Their story is a permanent reminder of the incredible and sometimes terrifying power of the human mind, how our beliefs can literally move our bodies to create art, to build civilizations, or to dance ourselves to death. It's a story about what happens when the world stops making sense and the desperate, sometimes beautiful, sometimes horrifying lengths we will go to in order to make it make sense again. History is not just about dates and dead people. It's about us. It's the greatest story ever told, and it's full of mysteries waiting to be unfolded. If you've been captivated by this story, if you want to join us as we uncover more of history's forgotten truths and hidden figures, then consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that bell icon. It truly helps us continue this work. Tell us in the comments, what do you think was the main cause? Ergot, mass hysteria, or something else entirely? This is The Past Unfolded. Thank you for watching. Until next time.